Dan. Yeah, I'm excellent. How are you? Yeah, it's fine. Here you could from somebody, I'm sure. Which one? The Pharaoh piece at Neiman, or yeah? Oh, Arp. Yeah, I wrote. Yeah, that was a few days ago. I wrote a piece this morning about. I've been writing about Tron too much, but they've been very much in the news. There's a longer piece at Neiman about the corporate intrigue there. Well, it is. You're right. It's cool. Right? Well, very much my work with Newsonomics is looking at two kinds of values. So for 12 years now, I've been a media analyst after my newspaper career, and it's really a set of parallel values that I learned as an editor in Knight Ridder Company over a 21-year career, and from the newspaper industry. I kind of fell into that industry, but what the values taught me were two. And first and foremost, for all of us in the newsroom and leading newsrooms, was being mission oriented. And that's what you often hear from nonprofits. So, what is it you're trying to do every day when you come to work? And we, at Daily Newspaper, very clear that we were trying to serve our communities, and I worked in three or four of them, every day and tell them what's going on, what the impact of that was, and what was coming up. So that value of informing, and as I came to think about it, not just informing but educating, so that people would actually learn more. And over time, especially in the last years at the print newspaper, trying to interact more to find out what people knew, what they wanted to know. So you have that set of values, which are traditional civic values of an informed citizen in a democracy. Parallel to that, Knight Ridder being a for-profit company, building financial value. So the way our society works is businesses are built by creating products and services that are of interest to enough consumers that they're willing to pay for them. And if enough pay for them, and if a business is well run, the business can do its job, pay its people, including journalists in this case, and continue to grow. What I learned combining those two is that those could be combined well, and certainly there were potential conflicts that would come up in newsrooms from time to time, but our principles were clear, our values were clear, and that is really what's informed my later career. Well, the way it fits together for me is that the internet, in its disruption, has greatly multiplied this fake news phenomenon. Now, if you went back pre-internet, which is now 20 years, the main sources of information for people were newspapers and they were television stations, and they had a lot of their own faults in terms of how they did their business, but their brands meant something, whether it was CBS or ABC or NBC or a little newspaper in Arkansas or the Washington Post. What the first phenomenon that really changed this in history was Fox News, which is several decades old at this point. And Fox News really borrowed a British model. And the British model was, doesn't need to be completely true. We can take innuendo and make it news, and we'll go with that, and we'll build a constituency of people who want their beliefs reinforced. And that's what Fox News did, and it did it successfully. And at the same time, we saw this rise of right-wing radio. That was similar to Fox in that way, building big ratings, telling people what they wanted to know. If we fast forward, I think what has clearly happened is the both accidental and cynical manipulation of digital news, which is becoming the main source of news for so many people in this last election cycle. Yet it wasn't a new phenomenon. It is one that we had seen over the last 5 years, particularly. It just got everybody's attention because of the Russian connection, the results of the election, and the astounding know-nothingism shown in a lot of the polls about how familiar American citizens were with actual facts. Yeah. Well, the British press is partisan by its nature, the print press, and so you have something like the Daily Mirror, which is a left tab newspaper. You have the Daily Sun, which is Murdoch's right-wing newspaper, but most newspapers there have a very different tradition than the American press in selectively picking stories that they think will align with their readers' interests and beliefs. So different variations, of course, of how much of that, but the press there is very much defined by, and has been for decades, by right and left. And that has not been the case, and that's not the history of the American press. Right, right. So I came up with that word. It's the best word I've come up with when I wrote my book in 2010, the Newsonomics book, first book, and I'm working on a second book now. The idea came to me soon after I left Knight Ridder 2005. The company was sold 1 year later to McClatchy Newspapers and disappeared as a company. But it was, yeah, see? And at the time, until it was sold, it was the second largest newspaper company in the country and had papers like the Mercury News and Philadelphia Inquirer and Miami Herald, really top drawer newspapers. When I went out, wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. I had worked on the digital side for Knight Ridder for 7 years, so I developed some real knowledge that most people in the industry didn't have for someone who had come out of the print newsroom. And I started writing about what I saw happening in the business. But very early on, I figured out that while I have opinions like everybody else on any manner of things, of journalistic practice, on political journalism. There are many people who had lots of views, and at that point, the term blogger was still thrown about pretty strongly. This is 2005, 2007. And I decided that while I had views on a lot of stuff, what was really important were the facts of what was going on. So I had an understanding of the news business as a business. I had always prided myself on learning that, even though I was in the newsroom. And then on the digital side, I learned that. So my quest, really simply, with Newsonomics has been, and now for a dozen years, to figure out how professional journalists are going to be paid in the digital news ecosystem that is developing. It's a very clear principle that you need well-paid, experienced journalists, and that since the business models under the newspaper business have collapsed, largely print and print advertising, the quest has been to find business models that are right now hybrid between digital and print and moving toward all digital that are going to pay enough journalists a living wage to report the news that the citizens of the United States need. I have made insufficient progress. I'm still working on the name, but it's a lot of best practices for the industry. Our report card is a mixed one. The best news is, we'll start with the good news first, and that's that on a national level, the internet is proving to be as much of a boon to national journalism as a detriment. So we especially have seen in the last 18 months the New York Times and the Washington Post really rise to the occasion and fully use, especially the smartphone to deliver the news, embrace video, embrace podcasts, able to, especially in the case of the Washington Post, actually add to its staff. And we see a number of other national news outlets. BuzzFeed has really distinguished itself in the last few months on the Russian investigations, for instance, but also Vox and other companies and Atlantic have come into play, especially with digital. So in national, we're in good shape. They're joined by ProPublica and other nonprofits. We need more, and we need more high-end national journalists and investigative journalists. And the good news is that people post-Trump election are opening their wallets, and we're seeing more money flow in. But go ahead. The big problem is, and the bad news is, most Americans have long depended for their local news and really their metro news in cities, and most of us live in cities, on daily newspapers. And those daily newspapers have had an unending cycle of woe for 10 years now. And the numbers are stark. In 1990, when we had about 70 million fewer people in the United States, we had 57,000 journalists working in daily newsrooms. Today, with 320 million people, we have only about 27,000 journalists working in daily newsrooms. So literally half the number of journalists in daily newsrooms, where most people get their news, and even worse, many of the most experienced people have been bought out or laid off because they're the most expensive. So we've had this great dumbing down of American regional and local newspapers for 10 years. And it's my belief that we saw I would hope, intermediate result of that in this last election. Absolutely. I mean, You're absolutely right about that, and that's the silver lining of this. And to your larger point of values here, what has happened in this era of fake news and of a president who lies freely and often is a incredible clarity of values that we haven't seen in America in a long time. I was just reading a story this morning about the money pouring into Meals on Wheels, just with it being threatened by a very preliminary draft national budget coming out of the White House. And we've seen the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, Southern Poverty Law Center, many, many institutions that people believe in as part of the civic fabric, they're now aware of, and as we're discussing, the Washington Post and the New York Times have seen an unprecedented bump in subscriptions, but they're not the only ones. Oregon Public Radio and public media has seen a huge bump. So are other stations in states around the country. People have gotten some clarity about what's important in their lives and their community. And I think our big challenge in 2017 on that civic level, on that values level, is to try to institutionalize that, to have people understand that where they put their money and their time matters. And so that's very encouraging at this point in history. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Infobay. Right. Well, it is, and it's very parallel to what you see with a BuzzFeed, a Quartz in the United States, what Vice is doing, what Vox is doing. The We would not think abstractly. If you had told us 20 years ago that the American press would be literally halved in number of journalists and more than halved in the amount of revenues, and that yet still these cultural issues of transitioning from a product that is mainly print to one that's becoming mainly digital would be so difficult for old line organizations, and I include TV companies in that, as well as newspapers and magazines. I would have said, you'd be kidding. You got to figure it out, but they haven't. And so when you have a clean sheet of paper, and you say, it's a very easy exercise, and you say, as Infobay is doing, or Atlantic Media, and you say, okay, we have an idea here of there's a certain kind of content we want to produce. Let's figure out who this audience is. How big is the audience? What do we really know about them? Then what kind of content do they want? Is that the same thing we want to produce? And once you're figuring that out, you're not dealing with printing presses. You're not dealing with trucks. You're not dealing with recalcitrant labor unions that may still have their work rules set from the 1930s. You're dealing with a very simple proposition of how do I get this set of content well presented, whether it's text or video or audio, to this group of people. And then the technology is much easier today than it was for We can talk about InfoBay in a minute, but technology is much easier. And then the simple question is, okay, how are you going to get paid? You're going to get paid by advertising in some form. You're going to get paid by readers in some form. That simplicity makes it very possible for new companies, as long as they have some capitalization, to get in there. And while the old companies are still fumbling around and trying to figure out how to, quote unquote, transition, they're taking market share away from them. In that story particularly, or that I wrote, it was about ARC. And ARC is the Washington Post content management system platform, basically everything that allows it to publish and then distribute to Facebook and sell advertising and do business intelligence. InfoBay, very smartly, I think, is using ARC. So that this whole notion of technology, which has dogged a lot of the press in this transition, becomes invisible. It's just like when we worked at a daily newspaper, I didn't worry every afternoon of, oh my God, how are we going to send out the stories? We had a press, we pushed buttons, somehow somebody laid out the pages, somebody else printed the paper, and somebody else distributed it to people's doorsteps. Literally, the new systems, and ARC is the most sophisticated, which is why I've written about it 3 or 4 times, gives any company, an old company or a new company, all the means to just focus on doing good journalism and building a business. And that's what the possibility is. And beyond our current dismal state and the numbers that I said, that's the potential into this next decade, and especially the 2020s, is a very cheap business to enter. And if you focus on really doing great journalism for an audience that is willing to pay you, this can be a growing business and, I think, a profitable one. Right. It is. It's very parallel. It's very parallel. Yeah. 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 Who? InfoBay? Oh, South China Point. Well, I don't know their particular strategy, but the truth of the matter is the world is moving digital. And if you look at all of the data, and I look at a lot of it, everyone up to and including baby boomers, and I'm one of them, and we're still right along with the millennials, the largest generation there. Everyone up through baby boomers are going digital, even though baby boomers will say, I kind of prefer print, and I like to turn on the TV. They are using a lot of digital news, and really the transformative factor for the final pin dropping for our print to digital migration is the smartphone. The ability of this smartphone to deliver news through the day, the notifications, the alerts, all of that has sounded the alarm for those who find it alarming of the death of print. And for the print as a daily newspaper vehicle will, I think, be all but gone by 2025. Gannett is already looking at moving some of their papers to 3 days, and has their smaller papers. We're going to see more of that, and that's going to be a global phenomenon. So it is digital, and those that either do it digital only, like InfoBay, or those that are smartly transitioning, like the Washington Post, can be in fine shape. But the clock is running really quickly on this now, both because of, on the one hand, mobile audience is growing dramatically. On the other hand, print advertising is still dropping in double digits. Yeah. So, in what sense? In the tell me a little more of what. Yeah, yeah. I mean, clearly that is part of, and people are talking about confirmation bias, right? They're saying people are seeing too much the stuff that they only agree with, and certainly some of that is true, and I'm a little concerned about it. At the same time, I think I'm seeing both in the presentation of news. New York Times just started something this week, in fact. It said, here are on the politics of the day, the budget, healthcare, et cetera, here are the best views from both left and right perspectives. Understanding that the New York Times reader is going to be leaning one way. They understand it. It's a pretty clear demographic, but they also know they have an audience that at least part of it wants to have a wider understanding and wants to know what other people think. It's treating the audience intelligently. In that case, what they're doing is they're curating stuff that people may not necessarily agree with, but they're saying, don't just go on Facebook and try to find stuff. Here's what we consider the best stuff. Here's articulate points of view. Now, I think the other solution to this, and it's slow coming on, is the ability for us to better filter our own content. So I think many people, and I think actually a majority of people, faced with an opportunity to say, show me the two best points of view that are different than mine. And remember, all of our reading is now tracked. So the Borg knows what we're reading. And if you or I, Susan, had the opportunity to push a button, I would call it a serendipity button, and say, show me two points of view that are different than mine, but please just show me the best ones. Well, maybe the most popular, maybe the best, maybe some combination of algorithm and human curation. I think a lot of people will do that. They haven't really been offered it yet. And at the same time, the other thing that makes me more confident this is going to work out is that people are spending a lot more time reading news. And so there is the ability to, and as long as they're reading beyond Facebook and beyond their bubble, to be exposed to more kinds of ideas. So it is a problem. It is not a problem of the digital age. It's the problem of where we're at in the digital age at this point. And I think it's a particular issue with Facebook that has grown into the wrong thing. I mean, it's a wonderful social network. Everybody loves it for that. But to pretend that it is a news vehicle, meaning the actual news produced that is done by journalists, is where Mark Zuckerberg has gotten into huge problems. Well, the lack of curation and a curation. So the fact that think back just a couple of years here. They mistakenly named what they showed us a news feed. Well, we know what news is traditionally. And what it was originally on Facebook a feed of what your friends were doing. Fine, right? It was your social feed. Well, for reasons of wanting more traffic and more engagement, they wanted news. They wanted to call it news. They wanted to bring actual news into it. But they mixed actual news created by journalists with what my cousin is telling me from Pennsylvania into one long list, last in, first out. It was banal, and then they doubled down on it, called themselves a news company. They actually then figured out as they were wading into this that they had no idea how to be a news company. So they hired a bunch of editors, calling them curators, with some decent talent, but disproportionately young, but a good team and maybe a step in the right direction, but clearly insufficient for what Facebook does every day. And what did they do? They hired them, and then Reince Priebus, who is now chief of staff in the White House, as the head of RNC, complained that they thought there were some stories that the Facebook curation team had put out there that were biased. They called Facebook before Congress. Facebook slinked back to Mountain View, fired its curation team, and said, we're going to do it fair and square. We're going to let the algorithm do it. And of course, algorithms are created by people. So they headed into the election system with an algorithm that was brainless in terms of determining real news from fake news, and we see the results today of that. So the big problem when we talk about fake news isn't the creation of fake news in and of itself, it's the recirculation of it. Google does a fairly good job of policing that. You go to Google News, it's coming from news sources that they have vetted. Facebook is the primary culprit here, rather than a kind of abstract notion of fake news, I believe. Well, you're quite welcome. It was very good to talk with you. Sure. I could say I'd do an online introduction. Sure. I know he's really busy. I actually contacted him on a story this week. I got a quick answer, but I know he's very busy. But happy to make an introduction. I think you did, but you can resend it if you want. Sure. It was. It was. Yeah. Let me know when you're publishing it. Here. Have a good weekend.